Here's a tough one for you. The McCann case. You don't have to give your opinion on it if you don't want to, but do you have a very strong, do you sway one way?
I've looked at footage. My personal opinion is
17 years on, and the case of Madeleine McCann still bleeds with unanswered questions. The police files are endless, suspects come and go, yet the truth remains buried. But what if the biggest clues were never in the evidence, but in the parents themselves? Darren Stanton, branded the Lie Detector, tears apart their interviews and reveals a chilling pattern: nervous gestures when calm words are spoken, past tense when talking about a child who should still be alive, smiles where grief should live. He stops short of calling them guilty, yet repeats one haunting phrase: "Something's very wrong." His words split the world in two: those who believe the McCanns are victims, and those who suspect a darker cover-up. This is not about what the McCanns said. It's about what their bodies could never hide. Darren Stanton is not a detective in the traditional sense. He does not carry a badge anymore, nor does he sift through DNA evidence or calm crime scenes with a flashlight. Instead, his battlefield is far more subtle: the twitch of an eyebrow, the shift of a hand, the blink that lingers too long. Once a frontline police officer in Nottingham and Derbyshire, Stanton built his early career chasing criminals, handling tense domestic disputes, and navigating the unpredictable world of law enforcement. It was in those encounters, often face to face with people trying desperately to conceal the truth, that he developed a fascination with deception. Over time, this fascination grew into a specialized expertise: the science and the art of reading human behavior. The transition was dramatic but natural. Stanton moved from pounding pavements and writing police reports to becoming one of Britain's most recognized commentators on body language and deception. The press soon gave him a title that stuck: the Lie Detector. It was a label both flattering and dangerous, suggesting an almost superhuman ability to see through facades. He embraced it, not as a boast but as a way to communicate the weight of his observations. His appearances on television made him a familiar figure. Whether on This Morning dissecting a politician's evasive answers, or on Judge Render's crime stories, analyzing a criminal suspect's twitching jaw, Stanton built a reputation as a man who could decode the truth hidden in plain sight. In the world of media, Darren Stanton became a fixture. Politicians, celebrities, criminals, grieving families. No one seemed beyond the reach of his analytical lens. He was called upon to break down Rupert Murdoch's tightly controlled composure during the phone hacking scandal, to evaluate Donald Trump's fiery rhetoric, to interpret Prince Harry's body language during his wedding to Meghan Markle. Each time, Stanton offered the public something they craved: a feeling that, despite rehearsed statements and polished PR, there remained a way to glimpse the truth. His role was not to prove guilt or innocence, but to highlight the cracks between words and reality. This duality, both respected and doubted, is at the heart of Stanton's career. Supporters see his 20 years of experience as proof that body language, when read in context, can reveal what lies beneath the surface. Skeptics counter that body language is not a science but an art, subjective and vulnerable to misinterpretation. After all, nervous gestures could signal guilt, or they could simply reflect the stress of being in the spotlight. Stanton himself admits the limitations. Body language is not admissible evidence in court. It cannot convict. Yet his analyses resonate precisely because they articulate what viewers often feel but cannot put into words. And nowhere has this resonance been more explosive than in the case of Madeleine McCann. Since May 2007, when 3-year-old Madeleine vanished from her family's holiday apartment in Portugal, the world has been obsessed with the case. For many, the mystery is not only about what happened to the child, but also about the parents, Kate and Jerry McCann. From the earliest days, their interviews were broadcast worldwide. They became faces of both tragedy and suspicion. Supporters saw devastated parents clinging to hope. Detractors saw polished spokespeople, strangely detached from grief. Into this maelstrom stepped Darren Stanton. For Stanton, the McCann case was unlike any other he had been asked to comment on. Over the years, countless audiences, producers, and journalists have posed him the same question: what do you see in the McCanns? He himself acknowledged that it is the single most requested topic of his career. Why? Because public opinion has always been sharply divided, and people wanted an expert to either confirm their suspicions or dispel them. Stanton did neither. Instead, he offered a careful but haunting assessment. When reviewing footage of the McCanns, he noted patterns that disturbed him. Their words spoke of innocence, yet their bodies seemed to leak unease. Their language insisted on one narrative, while their gestures hinted at another. And while Stanton never once declared them guilty, he dropped a phrase that has echoed ever since: "Something's very wrong." That phrase is a masterclass in ambiguity. On the one hand, it is cautious, it avoids the trap of accusation. Stanton never claimed the McCanns were responsible for their daughter's disappearance. On the other hand, it is damning. It plants the seed of doubt, suggesting that beneath the polished interviews lies a truth untold. In the world of media sound bites, "Something's very wrong" was both a warning and an invitation. Warning that the public should not take appearances at face value, an invitation to question what might be hidden. It is here that Stanton's influence became most controversial. Those who already distrusted the McCanns seized on his words as validation. The human Lie Detector had seen what they had always suspected. Those who supported the family accused Stanton of fueling conspiracy theories, of exploiting tragedy to gain attention. And yet, Stanton's assessment has remained consistent. He analyzes what is visible, not what is legally provable. He points out incongruence, not guilt. The interpretation, whether sinister or benign, is left for the audience. This dynamic, clarity mixed with ambiguity, explains why Stanton has remained at the center of the McCann debate. His credentials as a former police officer lend him authority. His reputation as a media analyst gives him visibility. His refusal to cross the line into direct accusation shields him from legal jeopardy. But the phrase, "something's very wrong," ensures he cannot escape the controversy. It is the spark that ignites endless comment sections, the line that ensures his analysis is never forgotten. For Stanton himself, the McCann case demonstrates the power and peril of his work. On one level, it highlights the public's hunger for answers in a case that official investigations have failed to resolve. On another, it reveals the dangerous weight his words can carry. Unlike politicians or celebrities, the McCanns are not public figures by choice. They are parents whose tragedy was thrust into the spotlight. To suggest, even indirectly, that their body language is incongruent with innocence is to feed a narrative that may never be undone. Yet Stanton has never shied away from this responsibility. In interviews and lectures, he reiterates the same principle. Body language should never be read in isolation. It must be contextualized, layered, and weighed carefully. And still, when it comes to the McCanns, he acknowledges a level of incongruence that he rarely sees elsewhere. For him, it is not about accusing, it is about acknowledging. Something does not fit. Something feels off. Something, in his words, is very wrong. And with a man whose career bridges law enforcement and psychology, whose reputation is both authoritative and contested, and whose single phrase has become a haunting refrain in one of the world's most enduring mysteries. In Darren Stanton's world of behavioral analysis, few ideas are more important than incongruence. At its core, incongruence simply means a mismatch between what is spoken and what is shown. The fracture between words crafted by the conscious mind and signals released involuntarily by the subconscious. Stanton has often explained that words can be rehearsed, polished, and delivered with the precision of a press statement, but the body is stubbornly honest. It leaks through micro-expressions, subtle gestures, slips of grammar, or fleeting contradictions in movement. These tiny betrayals are often the moments where truth peeks through the mask. Anyone who has ever felt uneasy while listening to someone speak has experienced incongruence, even if they did not have the vocabulary for it. Imagine hearing a man insist he is innocent while nodding his head in agreement, or watching someone smile faintly as they describe a tragedy. The mismatch hits the observer at a gut level. Something does not add up. Stanton argues that this uneasy sensation is not a coincidence, but a form of subconscious recognition. Our brains are wired to detect harmony between word and gesture. When harmony is absent, suspicion is born. In the interviews of Jerry and Kate McCann, Stanton noticed this mismatch repeatedly. Jerry, for example, would respond with a verbal, "no," yet his head gave the smallest nod in the opposite direction. It was not theatrical or obvious, but subtle enough to register as incongruent. Words of denial were paired with a gesture of affirmation. Stanton described such moments as leakages, pieces of information escaping from the subconscious despite efforts to maintain control. To him, this was not merely stage fright or the anxiety of being questioned on camera. The pattern suggested that what was being said and what was being felt were fundamentally out of step. Kate McCann's language offered another striking example. On several occasions, she spoke about her daughter in the past tense. Madeleine was slipped out where most parents would instinctively say, Madeleine is. At first glance, this could be dismissed as a minor grammatical lapse or the natural expression of someone in grief. But Stanton connected it to a deeper phenomenon recognized in forensic linguistics, linguistic leakage. This is when word choice, tense, or phrasing unintentionally reveals the speaker's true perception of events. To refer to a missing child as if she were already gone can signal an unconscious acceptance of death, even when the conscious narrative insists she is still alive. For Stanton, these moments of incongruence did not serve as direct evidence of guilt. He has always been clear, body language is not a smoking gun. It cannot convict in a court of law. But he likens it to the alert of a cadaver dog, not proof in itself, but a powerful signal that investigators should probe deeper. He calls incongruence a yellow flag, a warning that something beneath the surface may not align with the spoken story. The McCanns, he explained, raised more yellow flags than almost any other subjects he had studied. To illustrate how incongruence can be interpreted, Stanton often refers to other cases. Chris Watts, the Colorado man who murdered his wife and daughters, appeared on television feigning innocence. While he begged for their safe return, he smiled and crossed his arms with a relaxed confidence. His words screamed desperation, his body whispered deceit. In retrospect, the incongruence foreshadowed his confession. Yet Stanton is careful to balance this with cautionary tales, such as a case in India where a mother's defensive body language led to suspicion of her involvement in her child's death, only for it to be revealed as a lifelong nervous habit unrelated to guilt. These examples highlight both the power and the peril of reading incongruence. It can point toward hidden truths, but without context, it can also mislead. The McCann case sits uneasily between these extremes. Stress, trauma, and relentless media scrutiny can easily explain nervous tics, stiff body posture, or slips of the tongue. Stanton acknowledged this, but he emphasized that trauma does not typically produce systematic contradictions between word and gesture. Stress can explain trembling hands or avoidance of eye contact, but it does not usually make someone deny with their voice while affirming with their head. Nor does it naturally push a parent into consistent use of past tense when insisting their child is alive. In the McCanns, Stanton saw a pattern that went beyond nervousness. The more footage he studied, the more convinced he became that their signals were abnormal. Audiences latched onto this analysis with fervor. For those already suspicious of the McCanns, it felt like vindication. Their gut feelings had expert backing. For defenders of the family, it felt like a cruel misunderstanding, an exploitation of grief. The debate intensified. Stanton himself reminded viewers repeatedly that incongruence is not proof, but by naming the signs, by pointing out the nods that contradicted words, by highlighting the slips into past tense, he handed the public the vocabulary to articulate their unease. The result was a proxy trial fought not in courtrooms, but in living rooms and online comment sections, where body language became evidence in the court of public opinion. What makes Stanton's commentary so compelling is not just what he sees but how he frames it. He avoids sensational accusations, instead layering detail upon detail, allowing the incongruences to accumulate until the audience feels the dissonance themselves. He knows that when words and gestures diverge, people instinctively distrust. By guiding viewers to notice those fractures, he builds a narrative that is both careful and unsettling. In the end, incongruence in the McCann case becomes a mirror. It does not show a clear image of guilt, nor does it absolve. It shows cracks. It reveals tension between the story told and the story felt. Stanton insists this cannot be ignored. Whether it is evidence of deception, suppressed grief, or something far more complex, the mismatch demands scrutiny. To dismiss it outright would be to ignore the body's stubborn honesty. For Darren Stanton, incongruence is not just a theoretical tool, but the compass he uses to navigate the murky waters of human behavior. In the McCanns, that compass pointed consistently toward danger signs. He left the interpretation to others, but his warning still rings. When words and bodies refuse to align, something vital lies hidden beneath. And in this case, whatever is hidden may be the very key to one of the world's most haunting mysteries. One of Darren Stanton's most striking observations about the McCanns lies not in their words, nor even in the major contradictions of their narrative, but in the small, repetitive behaviors that surfaced when the pressure mounted. He calls them pacifying gestures, the subtle acts we perform to calm ourselves when anxiety overwhelms the system. These gestures, he explains, are universal. A child clutches a toy to feel safe. An adult folds their arms tightly across their chest. Someone under interrogation rubs their forehead or covers their mouth. They are the body's natural painkillers, fleeting self-comforts that signal stress. Stanton pays close attention to these moments because they often reveal the hidden turmoil beneath the surface of carefully chosen words. When watching interviews of Jerry and Kate McCann, Stanton noted these gestures again and again. Jerry would touch his face, rubbing his nose or shifting his jaw, as questions grew more direct. Kate often placed her hand near her mouth, sometimes brushing her lips with her fingers, sometimes pressing her palm lightly against her chin. Both displayed the classic folded arms across the torso, a move psychologists associate with self-protection, as if creating a barrier between themselves and the probing world outside. These movements might look ordinary to the untrained eye, but in the high-stakes setting of discussing a missing child, they take on deeper meaning. The gestures appeared most frequently not when the couple expressed grief, but when they were asked about the night Madeleine vanished. To Stanton, that timing was crucial. He explains that pacifying gestures are not inherently signs of lying. Everyone, innocent or guilty, will attempt to calm themselves when faced with stress. But the context matters. The greater the frequency and intensity of these gestures, the greater the likelihood that the individual is battling inner conflict. If one imagines the human body as a pressure cooker, pacifying gestures are the little steam valves releasing bursts of tension. In the McCann's case, Stanton felt the pressure rising most notably when the questions cut close to the bone, when the interviewers steered toward timelines, contradictions, or direct challenges to their account. At those moments, the bodies of Jerry and Kate seemed to scream with self-soothing rituals, even as their words remained composed. This is where the analysis of micro-expressions becomes vital. Pacifying gestures last seconds, but micro-expressions can vanish in less than the blink of an eye. Pioneered by psychologist Paul Ekman, the study of micro-expressions focuses on the involuntary facial movements that leak raw emotion before the conscious mind has time to suppress it. These are flashes of fear, sadness, guilt, or anger that ripple across the face for only a fraction of a second, often as brief as 1/5 of a second. Most people never notice them, but trained analysts like Stanton spend hours scrutinizing interview footage frame by frame, hunting for these elusive slips of the mask. In the McCann's case, Stanton identified several moments where micro-expressions betrayed deeper feelings than their words conveyed. One of the most striking involved Kate. While describing Madeleine, she momentarily shifted into the past tense, Madeleine was, and in that instant, her face flashed with a micro-expression of sadness. The downturn of the lips, the narrowing of the eyes, the subtle lowering of the brows, all signs of grief, but grief expressed as if for someone already gone. Stanton saw this as more than a grammatical slip. It was a window into her subconscious. If the conscious story was, Madeleine is alive and we are searching for her, the subconscious seemed to reveal an acceptance, however unspoken, that Madeleine was lost. Stanton is careful to clarify that these micro-expressions are not confessions. They do not prove complicity or direct knowledge. What they do prove is conflict. The conscious and unconscious are pulling in opposite directions, and the result is a fleeting fracture in the facade. In everyday life, this might occur when someone pretends to enjoy a gift they secretly dislike, or when an employee hides irritation at a boss's request. But in the context of a missing child, such incongruence carries far heavier weight. It suggests that beneath the polished exterior, another narrative struggles to break free. The significance of these gestures and expressions becomes clearer when compared to how innocent parents typically react in similar circumstances. Stanton points out that parents who are truly devastated often exhibit raw, congruent emotion. Their words and their bodies align, voices break, tears flow, shoulders collapse under the weight of grief. Even when they attempt to remain composed, their gestures leak genuine sorrow rather than defensive self-soothing. By contrast, the McCann's reliance on pacifying behaviors, the folded arms, the self-touching, the frequent mouth covering, suggested to Stanton not unfiltered grief, but careful management of appearances. Their bodies, he argued, seemed less concerned with mourning and more concerned with containment. What makes this analysis disturbing is the implication that such containment is necessary. Why, Stanton asks, would two parents desperate to find their missing child feel the need to constantly soothe themselves when recounting the details of that night? Why would the mention of Madeleine evoke subtle signs of suppressed guilt or finality, rather than unambiguous anguish? He does not answer directly, but the questions themselves leave a mark. The audience is left to wonder whether the McCann's subconscious betrayed knowledge they dared not voice. For Stanton, the body does not lie willingly. It leaks truths in fidgets and flashes, in micro-shadows across the face. He has spent decades training himself, and others to see what most overlook: the hand that unconsciously shields the mouth, the eyes that momentarily betray fear, the sigh that deflates a carefully rehearsed denial. The McCanns, in his analysis, were walking constellations of these leaks. To viewers, this transformed interviews that might have seemed controlled into eerie performances where the bodies spoke louder than the words. The impact on the audience was profound. Those already suspicious saw the gestures and micro-expressions as confirmation that the parents were hiding something dark. Those who defended the McCanns argued that Stanton's lens was unfair, that grief and exhaustion could easily produce the same behaviors. Yet even among supporters, the unease was hard to ignore. Once pointed out, the pacifying gestures and fleeting expressions stuck in memory. They became part of the case's mythology, the subtle signs replayed in forums and videos, fueling endless debate about what was genuine and what was staged. Ultimately, Stanton framed the pacifying gestures and micro-expressions of Jerry and Kate McCann not as verdicts, but as signals. And in a case already drowning in doubt, those quiet leaks of the body carried an unsettling weight. They whispered of inner truths that words refused to carry, leaving the world once again with the echo of Stanton's refrain: something, unmistakably, is very wrong. For Darren Stanton, body language is only half the story. Words themselves, when examined closely, can be just as revealing. Not simply what is said, but how it is said, the framing, the choice of tense, the pronouns emphasized or avoided. This is where the concept of distancing language enters his analysis, and where Kate McCann's words drew his sharpest attention. In one interview, Kate declared, "I want to tell my version." It was meant as a defense against critics, an attempt to reclaim the narrative from journalists, investigators, and authors who had painted her in a negative light. But to Stanton, the phrasing was more than defensive. It was a linguistic red flag. A version implies subjectivity. It carries with it the implicit acknowledgement that there are other versions, other perspectives, perhaps other truths. In ordinary life, people tell their story, their experience, their memory. But when a person reaches for the word version, it often signals that they are presenting not objective truth, but a crafted account. Stanton explained that truth, in its pure form, is singular. The reality of what happened to Madeleine exists as one sequence of events. To fragment it into versions is to invite interpretation, to admit that what is being shared is filtered, partial, even rehearsed. He called this an example of distancing language, the linguistic equivalent of holding the truth at arm's length. It is a way of insulating oneself from the raw, uncontrollable reality by wrapping it in the softer fabric of narrative. The McCanns, in Stanton's observation, often reached for such insulation, rather than making bold, concrete statements like, "Madeleine was abducted from our apartment." Kate tended to use formulations that drew the spotlight away from the child and onto the parents themselves. She said, "We have been slandered." She said, "We have suffered unspeakable pain." She stressed, "We have been portrayed unfairly." Each of these statements is undoubtedly true in its own right. The couple did face slander, did suffer pain, and did endure public vilification. But in interviews ostensibly about their missing daughter, Stanton noted that the center of gravity repeatedly shifted back to "wa" instead of "she." This, he argued, was psychologically significant. Innocent parents consumed by the terror of a missing child usually remain fixated on the child. Their sentences orbit the child's name: "She is out there, she needs help, please bring her back." The McCanns did say such things, but Stanton noted how often the focus slipped away from Madeleine to themselves. Instead of Madeleine being the consistent subject, the parents became the subject, their suffering the object. This was not, in Stanton's reading, the natural speech of parents lost in grief. It was the controlled rhetoric of individuals eager to establish their own innocence and shape public opinion. He drew attention to the book Kate McCann later published, simply titled Madeleine. On the surface, it was positioned as a memoir, a mother's plea to keep her child's story alive. Yet when Stanton examined the language, he found it resembled less a diary of maternal anguish and more a structured legal defense. Entire chapters framed the parents' ordeal in terms of accusations faced, reputations damaged, and the burden of suspicion. Madeleine herself, though central, often became a backdrop to the larger theme of vindicating the parents. In Stanton's view, the book functioned less as a beacon in the search for a missing child and more as a public relations counterstrike, a narrative constructed to absolve. To him, this pattern suggested that the McCanns were not merely grieving parents, but also individuals acutely aware of being on trial in the court of public opinion. Their interviews were not raw expressions of anguish, but carefully calibrated performances designed to defend their reputations. He did not claim this proved deception about the disappearance itself, but he underscored the incongruence. The words did not match what many expected from devastated parents. Instead of, "Madeleine needs us," it was often, "We have been wronged." Instead of, "She must be found," it was, "We have been treated unfairly." The audience, once this was pointed out, could not unhear it. Viewers began replaying old interviews, counting the number of times "we" replaced "she." The shift seemed subtle at first, but once highlighted, it became glaring. Those who already doubted the McCanns seized upon it as evidence that the parents were more concerned with their own image than with their child. Defenders countered that any parents under such extraordinary pressure would inevitably speak of their own suffering. Yet Stanton's framing planted a seed of doubt. The very language intended to protect the McCanns instead fueled suspicions that their priorities were inverted. The deeper meaning, Stanton suggested, lies in the psychology of defensive communication. When people are innocent, they typically welcome the raw articulation of their experience, however messy or unflattering. They do not need to package their grief or defend their reputations. The truth speaks for itself. But when individuals feel cornered, accused, or vulnerable, they often retreat into self-referential language. They become the subject, and the actual issue becomes the background. In Kate McCann's words, Stanton heard this retreat. He heard the voice of someone not just mourning, but also defending, not just pleading, but also rebutting. This dual track of communication, grief interwoven with defense, is what made the McCanns' language so controversial. On one hand, it was understandable. They were under relentless attack from media, police, and the public. On the other hand, it clashed with what many expected of parents who had lost a child. The result was a perception that the McCanns were staging a narrative rather than living a tragedy. For Stanton, this was perhaps the most telling incongruence of all. Words, like gestures, are supposed to reveal inner truth. And so, in analyzing Kate McCann's simple phrase, "my version," Stanton illuminated a wider pattern of communication. It was a reminder that deception, or at least concealment, does not always manifest in outright lies. Sometimes it hides in the framing, in the emphasis, in the shifting of subject from child to parent, from fact to narrative. He concluded that the McCann's language, whether consciously or unconsciously, was designed to distance, to shield, and to persuade. But in doing so, it also betrayed the very thing it tried to suppress, the possibility that their story, like the body language surrounding it, was not aligned with the raw truth. Darren Stanton's analysis of the McCanns never existed in a vacuum. His career has taken him across a spectrum of high-profile cases, and the patterns he observed in Jerry and Kate only gained weight when viewed alongside similar, or contrasting, examples. To Stanton, the true power of behavioral analysis lies in comparison. By examining how different individuals respond under similar pressures, he can distinguish ordinary nervousness from abnormal incongruence. Two cases in particular: the story of Chris Watts in the United States and the double murder in India served as critical lenses through which Stanton contextualized the McCanns. Together, they highlight the dual edges of body language analysis, its ability to expose deception and its capacity to mislead when context is absent. Chris Watts's story is one of the most chilling examples of incongruence Stanton has ever referenced. In 2018, Watts appeared on television pleading for the safe return of his wife and two young daughters, who had mysteriously disappeared. At first glance, he seemed calm, even cooperative. He faced cameras, offered sound bites, and appeared to embody the role of a husband desperate for answers. But for trained eyes like Stanton's, the incongruence was glaring. While professing grief, Watts smiled faintly. While insisting on his innocence, his arms remained casually folded, a posture that communicated relaxation rather than anguish. His tone carried not the desperation of a man searching for his family, but the polished cadence of someone performing. In retrospect, the incongruence was prophetic. Days later, Watts confessed to murdering his wife and children. The very behavior Stanton had flagged, the smiles, the casual stance, the mismatch between words and gestures, proved to be the body leaking its terrible truth. To Stanton, Watts became a textbook example of how the body betrays deception even as words struggle to maintain control. He used the case to demonstrate how incongruence can act as a radar, picking up signals of guilt that words cannot disguise. For the public, Watts's behavior became infamous, replayed endlessly on news segments and YouTube compilations as evidence of the uncanny accuracy of body language analysis. The lesson was stark. When the narrative and the nonverbal diverge too widely, something is profoundly wrong. Watts showed the world what it looks like when guilt hides behind a mask of false composure. And Stanton, in applying this lesson to the McCanns, emphasized that certain elements of their behavior, the pacifying gestures, the slips into past tense, the repeated self-focus, echoed that same pattern of incongruence. Not in the sense of proving criminal guilt, but in the sense of signaling a story more complicated than their words suggested. But Stanton is equally clear about the dangers of rushing to judgment. For every Chris Watts, there exists a case where incongruence misleads. He often cites the double murder case in India, where a teenage girl and a household servant were found dead in the family home. Suspicion quickly fell on the girl's parents, particularly the mother. Television footage captured her in interviews, where she appeared stiff, defensive, and unexpressive. Analysts at the time, including some in the media, pointed to her body language as evidence of guilt. Her crossed arms, lack of eye contact, and clipped responses were interpreted as the hallmarks of concealment. Yet Stanton later learned that these so-called red flags were actually the result of lifelong habits. The mother's defensive gestures were not situational, but ingrained behaviors formed long before the tragedy. In her culture, and in her personal history, such gestures were common. They did not signal guilt but personality, Context, Stanton emphasized, was everything. Without understanding the woman's background, analysts risked misreading her behavior entirely. Ultimately, the Indian case became a cautionary tale about the limits of body language. It reminded Stanton, and his audiences, that while the body may not lie, it can certainly be misunderstood. Placing these two examples side by side illustrates the balance Stanton always strives for. Chris Watts showed how incongruence can expose hidden guilt. The Indian mother showed how incongruence can appear where no guilt exists. One case validates the method, the other tempers it with humility. Stanton invokes both to clarify his approach to the McCanns. On the one hand, the sheer volume of incongruent signals in their interviews cannot be ignored. On the other, the possibility of misinterpretation must always be considered. For Stanton, the key is the accumulation of signs. A single pacifying gesture proves nothing. A slip of the tongue into past tense could be a simple mistake. Even an occasional focus on "weh" rather than "she" might reflect the extraordinary pressure they endured. But when these signs appear repeatedly, consistently, and especially when triggered by direct questions about the night of Madeleine's disappearance, the weight of the evidence mounts. In his view, the McCanns exhibited an unusually high frequency of incongruence, far greater than what he had seen in most innocent subjects under stress. That abnormality, he argued, was itself significant. He stopped short, as always, of saying this proved involvement. His language was careful, his tone professional, but he could not ignore the pattern. In Watts, incongruence foretold guilt. In India, incongruence missiled because it lacked context. In the McCanns, incongruence appeared again and again, and Stanton struggled to find contextual explanations that could account for all of it. Stanton's comparisons also served a rhetorical purpose. By invoking cases the public already knew, the shocking confession of Watts, the controversial prosecution in India, he framed the McCanns within a wider narrative of how humans leak truth. The audience was invited to measure the couple against known patterns of deception and misinterpretation. And in that comparison, the conclusion seemed unavoidable. Whatever else might be said, the McCanns' behavior was not typical. Their incongruence was too pronounced, their gestures too frequent, their slips too telling. Something about their story did not align. The lesson, Stanton reminded viewers, was not to convict on body language, but to listen more carefully to what the body reveals. Watts had shown the world that incongruence can be a screaming siren of guilt. The McCanns occupied a disturbing middle ground, not as obvious as Watts, not as easily excused as the Indian mother, but marked by an abnormal level of subconscious leakage. For Stanton, this was the heart of the matter. Incongruence is a tool, not a verdict. It demands careful application, awareness of culture, and sensitivity to trauma. But when it appears in overwhelming measure, it cannot be dismissed. And in the case of the McCanns, it appeared so often, in so many forms, that Stanton could only repeat his haunting refrain, something undeniably is very wrong. When Darren Stanton's observations about the McCanns reached the public, they detonated like a spark in dry tinder. His words did not land in a neutral space. They fell into a debate already simmering with emotion, suspicion, and fatigue. For 17 years, people had argued about the parents, and now here was a professional, someone branded, the human Lie Detector, pointing to troubling signs. Though Stanton never accused the couple outright, audiences seized upon his comments as if they were verdicts. The reactions were immediate, passionate, and profoundly divided. On one side were those who had long distrusted Kate and Jerry. For this group, Stanton's analysis was not merely an interesting perspective, it was validation. They felt, at last, that an expert had articulated the unease they had carried since 2007. Comment sections under YouTube clips of Stanton's interviews filled with sentiments like, "Finally, someone professional sees what we've been saying all along." Others wrote, "I knew their behavior was off, but I didn't have the words for it." Now Stanton confirms it. These viewers treated him as a kind of interpreter, the one who translated gut feelings into technical language, pacifying gestures, linguistic leakage, incongruence. In their eyes, he was not just an analyst, he was a truth teller who dared to say what officials would not. This sense of vindication created a fervent following around Stanton's remarks. His phrases, especially, "something's very wrong," were quoted like scripture in online debates. Supporters argued that the establishment had shielded the McCanns for years, and now the body language expert had pierced through the facade. They praised him for neutrality, yet paradoxically took his neutrality as confirmation of guilt. The irony was striking. By refusing to accuse directly, Stanton left room for interpretation, and the suspicious filled that room with certainty. On the opposite side stood those who had defended the McCanns from the beginning. For them, Stanton's analysis was not validation but cruelty. They saw a grieving couple already subjected to relentless media hounding, only to now have their gestures and word choices dissected under a microscope. Critics accused Stanton of fueling conspiracy theories, of giving a pseudo-scientific gloss to unfounded suspicion. Body language isn't science, they wrote. It's guesswork dressed up as expertise. These defenders argued that grief manifests in countless ways, that the stress of cameras and suspicion could easily explain the so-called incongruence. To them, Stanton was not a beacon of truth, but another voice adding to the chorus of unfair judgment. This divide did not remain confined to comment sections. The media amplified it, especially tabloids eager for sensational headlines. Newspapers splashed bold captions, "Body language expert says McCann's hiding something," or "Human Lie Detector spots disturbing signs in parents' interviews." These headlines, of course, exaggerated Stanton's actual statements. He had never accused, never declared guilt, but nuance is not the currency of tabloids. Sensation is. And so his careful phrasing became distorted into insinuations, feeding both sides of the debate with fresh ammunition. Skeptics waved the clippings as proof. Supporters dismissed them as manipulative journalism. The mainstream press, too, struggled with the tension. Some outlets treated Stanton as a credible professional offering a valuable perspective. Others criticized the coverage as irresponsible, warning that analyzing grief-stricken parents on television blurred the line between entertainment and investigation. Yet, whether critical or supportive, the media ensured that Stanton's words echoed far beyond their original setting. His analysis became part of the story, woven into the mythology of the McCann case itself. Caught in this storm, Stanton himself became a contested figure. He was praised as courageous and condemned as reckless, celebrated for his insight and scorned for his supposed opportunism. Audiences projected onto him their own biases. To the suspicious, he was the voice of suppressed truth. To the sympathetic, he was a performer capitalizing on tragedy. The irony is that Stanton had tried to remain in the middle, always emphasizing that body language is not proof but signal. Yet in the polarized climate surrounding the McCanns, neutrality was impossible. His attempt to walk the line only ensured that both sides would claim him or attack him. The effect on the broader discourse was striking. Conversations about Madeleine's disappearance, already fraught, became further entangled with debates about behavioral science itself. Was body language analysis a legitimate discipline, or a modern form of divination? Could gestures and slips of the tongue really expose secrets, or were they too subjective to carry weight? Stanton's comments forced these questions into the public arena. They became a proxy debate for something larger: how we interpret truth when hard evidence fails. The scale of public reaction can be measured by the intensity of online exchanges. Forums dedicated to the case dissected Stanton's every word, replayed clips of the McCann's interviews, and annotated them with time-stamps of nods, hand movements, or facial expressions. Entire threads debated whether Kate's use of past tense was a slip of grief or an unconscious confession. Others cataloged Jerry's gestures frame by frame, mapping them against Stanton's descriptions of pacifying behaviors. In digital spaces, his analysis became raw material for citizen investigations, often straying far from his measured caution into realms of certainty he never endorsed. Even among those who respected Stanton, there was discomfort with the implications. If his analysis was accurate, what did it mean for the pursuit of justice? Could society tolerate the idea that parents of a missing child might be judged not on evidence but on gestures? And if his analysis was flawed, what damage might it cause to individuals already carrying unbearable grief? These questions haunted the debate, leaving many unsure whether Stanton's contribution illuminated the truth or deepened the shadows. What cannot be denied is that his observations intensified the emotional polarization. Skeptics felt empowered, defenders felt wounded, and the media profited from the clash. Stanton had not solved the mystery, but he had amplified its resonance. He had turned subtle gestures and fleeting expressions into points of global contention. In doing so, he became part of the case's legacy, not just an observer, but a participant in the story's unfolding. The ultimate irony is that Stanton himself never strayed from his mantra. He insisted that his role was to highlight incongruence, not to pass judgment. He repeated that body language should be seen as a guide, not a gavel. Yet once released into the public sphere, his words took on a life of their own. The phrase, "something's very wrong," became detached from its cautious origin and transformed into a rallying cry or a curse, depending on who uttered it. The reaction was not just divided, it was explosive. And so, Darren Stanton, the man who sought to interpret silence, found himself pulled into the loudest debate of all. His analysis of the McCanns became less about behavioral science and more about public perception, less about subtle gestures and more about how society processes uncertainty. In trying to read the parents, Stanton inadvertently revealed something about the world itself, that when faced with mystery, people do not seek neutrality. They seek sides. They seek affirmation. They seek certainty, even when certainty is impossible. The result was a battlefield where Stanton was both weapon and target, his neutrality reinterpreted, his caution overshadowed, his reputation alternately exalted and maligned. He had opened a window into the subconscious of the McCanns, but in the process, he also exposed the subconscious of a divided public, a world desperate for answers, unwilling to settle for doubt, and ready to fight over even the smallest gesture. When Darren Stanton spoke about the McCanns, he chose his words carefully, always reminding audiences that body language was not proof of guilt. Yet the public, hungry for certainty, often took his observations and stretched them into theories. Each incongruence he highlighted, the nod that contradicted a denial, the slip into past tense, the shift of focus from child to parents, became seeds from which speculation grew. Out of these seeds emerged three dominant theories: the idea of a cover-up, the suspicion of an accidental death concealed, and the notion of embedded confessions, hidden within their language. The first and most enduring theory was that of a cover-up. Viewers interpreted Stanton's phrase, "something's very wrong," as a diplomatic way of saying the parents knew more than they admitted. If their words and gestures were out of sync, then surely, the reasoning went, they were withholding crucial details. Supporters of this theory argued that the McCanns' polished interviews, their focus on reputation, and their frequent use of distancing language all pointed to deliberate concealment. The cover-up hypothesis did not always specify what was being hidden. Some suggested it was negligence, others believed it was knowledge of Madeleine's fate. But the common thread was the belief that the parents were not telling the full story. For those already skeptical, Stanton's analysis provided the professional stamp that legitimized their suspicions. Closely linked to the cover-up idea was the theory of an accident. This narrative suggested that Madeleine may have died in the apartment through misadventure, a fall, perhaps, or an overdose of medication, and that the parents panicked, fearing blame, and concealed the truth. Stanton himself never endorsed this idea, but his observations about linguistic leakage, especially Kate's slips into the past tense, became evidence in the minds of many. "She already thinks Madeleine is dead," viewers concluded. The micro-expressions of sadness caught on her face when she said, "Madeleine was," reinforced the belief that, at some level, Kate had accepted a finality not admitted publicly. Those who held this theory treated Stanton's analysis as a spotlight. It illuminated the cracks in the official narrative, making the possibility of an accidental death seem plausible. The third theory was more subtle but no less powerful: the idea of embedded confession. In forensic linguistics, this term refers to the way people may unintentionally admit truths through word choice. Stanton had drawn attention to Kate's statement, "I want to tell my version." To many, This was more than self-defense. It was a tacit acknowledgement that her account was subjective, not factual. Similarly, when the McCanns emphasized their own suffering, "We have been slandered. We have endured terrible pain." Some interpreted this as a confession that the story was really about them, not about Madeleine. According to this theory, the parents revealed more than they intended. By focusing on their own plight rather than their child, they subconsciously confirmed what critics already suspected, that they were protecting themselves rather than seeking their daughter. What united these theories was not evidence in the legal sense, but the way Stanton's analysis framed perception. He had never said, "The McCanns are guilty." He had never endorsed the accident hypothesis or declared their statements confessions. Yet by identifying incongruence, by pointing to slips of language and mismatched gestures, he created fertile ground for interpretation. His neutrality allowed the audience to project their own conclusions. And in a case where official investigations had failed to provide closure, those projections quickly hardened into convictions. For skeptics, Stanton's words became a toolkit. They replayed interviews and matched each nod, each hand movement, each phrase against his framework of incongruence. Online forums filled with annotated transcripts and slowed-down video clips, viewers convinced they were unearthing confessions hidden in plain sight. For defenders of the McCanns, this was deeply unfair, a distortion of grief into evidence, a misapplication of behavioral science. They accused Stanton's followers of turning ambiguity into accusation, of reading too much into the natural chaos of human expression. But even critics had to acknowledge that the theories persisted because they fit into the empty spaces left by the investigation. What makes Stanton's role so paradoxical is that he always cautioned against exactly this kind of leap. He called incongruence a yellow flag, not a verdict. He warned that body language must be contextualized, that cultural and personal habits can distort interpretation. Yet in the McCann case, his very caution seemed to intensify the speculation. By refusing to declare a conclusion, he allowed the public to fill the silence with their own. And in the eyes of many, silence itself was suggestive. Why else, they wondered? Would he stop short of accusation, if not because he sensed a truth too dangerous to state outright? The result was that Stanton's analysis, though intended as neutral, became ammunition. The cover-up theory, the accident hypothesis, and the embedded confession idea all drew strength from his observations. None of these theories could stand in a courtroom, but in the arena of public opinion, they thrived. They offered coherence where chaos reigned, narrative where uncertainty prevailed, and though Stanton did not plant these theories, his words fertilized the soil in which they grew. In the end, what his analysis revealed may say as much about the audience as about the McCanns. People crave answers, and in the absence of hard proof, they cling to signs, signals, and suspicions. Stanton gave them a language for their doubts, incongruence, leakage, distancing. With those tools, the public built theories that, though unproven, continue to shape the conversation. Whether these theories are fair or unjust remains contested, but their persistence testifies to the power of a single phrase, a single gesture, a single slip of the tongue, to ignite the imagination of a world desperate for resolution. Throughout his career, Darren Stanton has maintained the same mantra: "I do not accuse anyone. I only analyze behavior." It is a line he repeats in interviews, lectures, and television appearances, a shield that protects both his professional credibility and his legal safety. As a former police officer, he knows the weight of accusation and the dangers of stepping beyond the boundaries of evidence. His expertise lies in reading signals, not in pronouncing guilt. Yet when it comes to the McCann case, Stanton's words have not been received as neutral observations. To the public, especially those who scrutinized every detail of his commentary, his statement that "something's very wrong" carried the force of a verdict. The irony is sharp. By insisting on neutrality, Stanton thought he was preserving objectivity. But in practice, the very phrase designed to stop short of accusation sounded to audiences like a judgment cloaked in caution. To say, "I don't accuse," and then to add, "something's very wrong," is for many listeners indistinguishable from saying, I believe they are hiding something. The impact of language is not only in what is said, but in how it is heard. And in this case, the hearing was loud. For skeptics, Stanton's refrain became a rallying cry. They saw him as the professional who dared to hint at what police and prosecutors would not say aloud. His caution was interpreted not as restraint, but as coded confirmation. Online forums and comment sections treated "something's very wrong" as if it were a diplomatic translation of outright suspicion. In the court of public opinion, he was no longer an analyst, but an accuser, albeit one who chose his words with surgical care. For supporters of the McCanns, the same phrase had the opposite effect. To them, Stanton had crossed an invisible line. He might not have named guilt directly, but by suggesting profound abnormality, he planted a stigma that would never fade. They argued that his words were reckless, that he had given fuel to conspiracy theories without offering proof. One supporter wrote bluntly, "He may say he doesn't accuse, but he accuses with every word." To this audience, Stanton was not neutral at all, but a subtle prosecutor hiding behind the language of analysis. This tension highlights both the strength and weakness of Stanton's approach. On the one hand, by stopping short of accusation, he protected his professional integrity. He remained within the boundaries of his field, analyzing signals, noting incongruence, warning of dissonance. He did not claim access to evidence, nor did he pretend to solve the case. This gave him credibility as an expert, someone who could be invited to television panels and trusted not to expose producers to legal risk. His refusal to cross the line kept him safe, both legally and professionally. On the other hand, the very ambiguity that safeguarded him also created the space for projection. Audiences filled that space with their own convictions. Skeptics took his words as proof of guilt, supporters as proof of slander. Stanton himself became a kind of Rorschach test. People saw in him what they already believed. The neutrality he claimed was not experienced as neutral, it was interpreted through the lens of bias. As a result, he was pulled unwillingly into the role of combatant, weaponized by one side, vilified by the other. The strength of Stanton's approach was also its weakness in terms of public impact. His refusal to accuse gave him an aura of professionalism and restraint, which in turn amplified the gravity of his words. If he had been more dramatic, calling the McCanns liars outright, many would have dismissed him as sensationalist. But because he was careful, because he insisted on neutrality, the hint of accusation carried even more power. Viewers thought, if even someone this cautious says something's wrong, it must mean something. His credibility made his subtle warnings more potent than blunt attacks. Yet the downside was unavoidable. By framing his analysis in this way, Stanton became a tool for those eager to condemn the McCanns without evidence. His phrases were ripped from context, plastered onto headlines, and quoted endlessly in online debates. He became, unwillingly, part of the prosecution in the court of public opinion. And with that role came the backlash. Stanton himself has pushed back against such accusations, reiterating that his role is to identify signals, not to draw conclusions. But the gap between intention and reception is wide. In a case as emotionally charged as Madeleine McCann's disappearance, neutrality is impossible. Every statement becomes ammunition for one side or the other. Even silence becomes suspect, interpreted as avoidance or concealment. Stanton's middle ground, neither confirming nor denying, neither accusing nor absolving, only deepened the perception that he was hinting at something unspeakable. And so, Stanton occupies a peculiar position. He is respected as a professional who maintains boundaries, yet simultaneously criticized as a man who wields enormous influence without accountability. He has turned body language into a language for public debate, giving millions a way to articulate their doubts and suspicions. But he has also become entangled in the very drama he set out to analyze, his words echoing louder than he ever intended. In the end, the question of whether Darren Stanton is a neutral analyst or a subtle accuser may be unresolvable. He insists on neutrality, and legally he is correct. But perception matters more than intention in the public sphere. And the perception is clear. To skeptics, he is the expert who finally confirmed their doubts. To supporters, he is the analyst who unfairly smeared grieving parents. His greatest strength, careful restraint, is also the very reason he is seen as complicit. Perhaps that is the unavoidable fate of anyone who studies deception. The moment one points to incongruence, one steps into dangerous territory, neither accusation nor absolution, but a twilight zone where every word carries more weight than intended. Stanton lives in that zone. And in the McCann case, it has made him both trusted and distrusted, respected and reviled. A man who sought only to interpret signals, but ended up sending signals of his own. If there is one enduring lesson from Darren Stanton's work, it is that the human body resists deception. Words may be rehearsed, legal teams may craft statements, and media consultants may train posture and tone. Yet the body finds ways to leak its truth. The McCann case, through Stanton's eyes, became not only a story about a missing child, but also a study in how nonverbal signals can haunt a narrative long after words fade. For ordinary people, the lesson is practical. Stanton urges us to notice the subtle signals we often ignore. The fleeting shrug when someone insists they are confident, the tiny nod betraying agreement during a verbal denial, the sudden self-soothing gesture when a topic grows uncomfortable. These signs, though never to be read as absolute proof, are early warnings of incongruence. They allow us to navigate conversations more wisely, to sense when something is unsaid, or when trust should be cautious. To be attentive to nonverbal cues is to protect ourselves in daily interactions, whether in business negotiations, personal relationships, or moments when the stakes are high. For the media, the lesson is about responsibility. Stanton's analysis of the McCanns showed how fragile the line is between observation and accusation. A phrase like, "something's very wrong," can be magnified into headlines that imply guilt where none was stated. Journalists and broadcasters must remember that behavioral analysis is not a substitute for evidence, nor is it a verdict. It is a tool, a lens, a perspective. To treat it as a gavel is to risk injustice. If the public is to learn from these analyses, they must also be reminded that body language, while revealing, remains circumstantial. In the frenzy for clicks and ratings, that reminder is often lost, and the result is a distortion that can scar lives. For the McCanns themselves, the lesson is darker. Their body language has never erased suspicion, even as investigations shifted, even as new suspects emerged. The footage of their interviews continued to be replayed, analyzed, and dissected. Gestures, slips of language, and fleeting expressions became as enduring in the public imagination as the facts of the case itself. Stanton did not claim to know what happened to Madeleine, but his observations left audiences with a nagging doubt. Is there something they are not telling us? That question has lingered, not because of hard evidence, but because of the stubborn honesty of human behavior. And so, Stanton's work leaves us at an uneasy crossroads. He teaches that the body cannot lie for long, that incongruence is a signal of conflict between inner truth and outer performance. But he also warns that signals must be read with caution, contextualized, and never mistaken for proof. The McCanns, in his analysis, exhibited more incongruence than he would expect from grieving parents, enough to trouble him, enough to trouble millions. Yet even here, he resisted accusation, knowing that suspicion can wound as deeply as guilt. His role was not to solve the mystery, but to ensure the public did not ignore the whispers beneath the words. In the end, the case of Madeleine McCann remains unresolved. The evidence is incomplete, the theories contested, the truth elusive. What Stanton contributed was not a solution, but a lens, a way of seeing that unsettled, provoked, and forced reconsideration. His analysis reminds us that behind every polished statement lies a human body, and that bodies have their own language, one harder to disguise than words. The world continues to ask what happened to Madeleine. No analyst, no detective, no journalist has been able to give a definitive answer. But what lingers, thanks to Stanton, is the sense that truth leaves traces even when buried. A hand raised to the mouth, a nod out of sync, a word in the past tense, these may not close the case, but they keep it alive in our minds. They keep us asking questions, refusing to accept the neatness of official narratives. And perhaps that is the final lesson. The body, in its restless honesty, ensures that mysteries like Madeleine's never fully fade. Evidence may be inconclusive, suspects may be cleared, But as long as there are signals that contradict words, the world will not let go. The truth may remain hidden, but the body's whispers echo on, a reminder that something in this story, something vital, has yet to be told.